Hey guys, welcome back. And tonight, we're diving into something most people never think about. You know how we obsess over where our food comes from? Well, imagine that curiosity about exotic ingredients set 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome, when the empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Middle East. The people eating these meals didn't have food delivery apps or grocery stores. They had something far more complicated, an entire machinery of trade, adventure, danger, and determination stretching across thousands of miles. Roman chefs cooking for the wealthy were like hunters of flavor in a vast, unpredictable world. So grab your seat, pour yourself a drink, and let's journey back to Rome's kitchens, where a chef's greatest challenge wasn't technique. It was figuring out how to get the ingredients. And trust me, that story is worth hearing. When you think about the Roman Empire at its height, you might picture legions marching, senators debating in marble halls, gladiators fighting in arenas. But underneath all of that, there was something equally important, constantly moving, constantly trading, constantly bringing the flavors of the known world back to Roman tables. The spice trade was the invisible heartbeat of Roman culinary ambition. And it was brutal. The most prized ingredients, the ones that made wealthy Romans spend fortunes, came from lands so distant most people would never see them. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, cloves, nutmeg, and mace from Indonesia. These weren't just flavor enhancers. They were status symbols, proof you had wealth and connections to reach across the known world. A wealthy Roman serving pepper at dinner was saying, "I have access to things you can't imagine. I have power. I have connections that stretch to the world's edges." But getting these spices to Rome was a nightmare. There was no direct route. Instead, a labyrinth of traders, merchants, middlemen, and pirates jockeyed for control. The journey took months, sometimes years. You'd start with pepper from the Malabar coast, where peppercorns hung like tiny promises of profit. But getting it out of India wasn't simple. You had to navigate local rulers, some friendly, some not. You had to get the pepper to a port. Then you had to pray the monsoons cooperated, because shipping routes were dictated by wind patterns. Miss the season, and you'd wait months. Even when ships set sail, the journey across the Arabian Sea was treacherous. Pirates hunted merchant ships. Storms could capsize vessels in minutes. Diseases ravaged crews. A shipment might take 6 months just to reach Egypt or Arabia. Then it had to be bought, sold, traded, packaged, and shipped again. By the time pepper reached a Roman market, it had passed through dozens of traders, each one taking a cut, each one adding to the cost. Roman chefs and the wealthy paid premium prices. We're talking staggering money. Pepper was nearly worth its weight in gold. A pound of cinnamon cost what a laborer earned yearly. Nutmeg and cloves were even pricier. But wealthy Romans wanted them anyway. They wanted prestige. They wanted flavors. They wanted access to the world's rarest treasures. That demand created the entire trade network. It was a machine that took centuries to build. Roman emperors and merchants invested enormous resources in establishing routes, building posts, negotiating with distant rulers. They had to figure out who controlled what, who would trade with Rome, what Roman goods were valuable enough for spices. Roman wine was exceptional and hugely popular in Eastern markets. Roman glassware, clear glass that was rare and precious. Roman textiles, olive oil, metal goods. These became the currency of trade. You couldn't just sail to India and demand pepper. You had to offer something in return. You had to negotiate. You had to understand what had value in those distant markets. The spice trade wasn't just about greed, though there was plenty of that. It was about logistics, navigation, politics, and obsessive determination to bring world flavors to Roman tables. It was essential to Roman haute cuisine. When a Roman chef planned menus, they weren't just thinking about taste. They were thinking about what ingredients were available, what had just arrived in markets, what their patron could afford. The supply chain dictated everything. If pepper had recently arrived from India, it would appear in multiple dishes. If cinnamon had just come from Arabia, you'd see it in everything from sauces to desserts. Chefs were working within global supply chains, reacting to what was available, what had just arrived, what was in fashion at that moment. Because yes, there were fashions in ingredients too. Certain spices would become trendy, wildly popular for a season or two, then fall out of favor. Roman chefs had to stay aware of these trends, had to know what the wealthy wanted, had to be ready to adapt when new ingredients arrived. A chef who could work with the latest exotic ingredients was a chef in demand. A chef who didn't understand the supply chain, who couldn't adapt when supplies ran short, who wasn't aware of what was available and what was coming, well, that chef didn't last long in a wealthy household. Beyond spices, Roman chefs were also hunting for other exotic ingredients from across the empire and beyond. Garum was an absolute staple, a fermented fish sauce made primarily in Spain and North Africa that was shipped across the empire in massive quantities. If you had a wealthy Roman kitchen, you had garum. The smell was apparently absolutely foul, horrifying even by ancient standards, but the flavor was essential to Roman cooking. It showed up in almost everything: sauces, soups, roasted meats, even some desserts. Getting garum to Rome meant maintaining supply chains from Spain and North Africa, hiring merchants who specialized in shipping it without it spilling or spoiling, negotiating with producers to ensure consistent quality. A single wealthy Roman kitchen might go through hundreds of liters of garum in a year. That's a lot of fermented fish, and it all had to be transported, usually by ship, sometimes overland, always with the risk of spoilage or loss. Exotic salts were another prized commodity. Table salt from specific regions had different qualities, different mineral contents, different flavors. Chefs would request salts from particular areas. Some Roman chefs were snobs about salt, just like modern chefs might be particular about their sea salt or Himalayan pink salt. They wanted salt from certain evaporation ponds in Egypt or from specific regions around the Mediterranean. Getting those salts meant dealing with regional producers, negotiating shipping, making sure the salt arrived without being contaminated or degraded by moisture. Fresh fruits were another challenge, particularly exotic nes. Rome was warm. Mediterranean fruits were available, sure, but Roman wealthy wanted more. They wanted pomegranates from the Middle East, figs from across the empire, dates from the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East. These fruits could be dried, which helped with preservation and transportation, but fresh fruit was prized when you could get it. A chef with access to fresh exotic fruits was a chef with enormous prestige. It meant they had connections, they had resources, they had the ability to get things that most people could only dream about. Wines from across the empire were constantly being sourced, traded, and evaluated. Roman chefs and their patrons could be incredibly particular about wine. Greek wines, Egyptian wines, Italian wines, each had different qualities and price points. A wealthy household might have a wine steward, someone whose entire job was sourcing, tasting, and evaluating wines to pair with meals. These wine stewards traveled, negotiated with producers, maintained relationships with merchants, all to ensure that their patron's table had access to the best wines available. It was a specialized skill, and it commanded good pay. Then there were the ingredients that came from Rome's military conquests and colonial possessions. North Africa provided not just garum, but also exotic animals and birds that chefs could use. Ostrich, for instance. Exotic game from the interior of Africa came to wealthy Roman tables, sometimes as a luxury item, sometimes as a test of a chef's ability to prepare something completely unfamiliar. The Roman military controlled trade routes in these regions, which meant that certain ingredients became available to the empire that wouldn't have been otherwise. A wealthy Roman with military connections could get ingredients that others couldn't. It was a form of power, a way to show status and influence. The logistics behind all of this were staggering. You had merchants traveling constantly. You had ships being built and maintained specifically for long-distance trade. You had storage facilities, warehouses, docks, all the infrastructure of a complex supply chain. You had people whose entire job was negotiating with foreign rulers, figuring out what goods could be traded, what routes were safe, what seasonal considerations existed. A single shipment of pepper or cinnamon might involve dozens of people, months of planning, thousands of miles of travel, and enormous financial investment. And if something went wrong, if a ship sank, if a merchant was robbed, if a supply route became dangerous, well, that affected the menus of wealthy Romans. It meant prices went up. It meant certain ingredients became scarce. It meant chefs had to adapt, had to find alternatives, had to be creative with what was available. Roman chefs had to be problem solvers. They had to understand not just how to cook, but how to work within the constraints of global supply chains. They had to know their ingredients, where they came from, what seasons they were available in, how to store them properly, how to preserve them if they had excess. A chef who didn't understand these things was a chef who would run out of key ingredients at crucial moments. A chef who understood them, who maintained good relationships with merchants, who knew which suppliers were reliable, who could stretch ingredients when supplies were short. That was a valuable chef. That was someone who could keep a wealthy household eating well even when supply chains were disrupted. Some of the most successful Roman chefs were the ones who understood that cooking wasn't just about technique. It was about sourcing. It was about relationships with merchants and traders. It was about understanding the global economy and your place in it. And it was about the relentless pursuit of getting the best ingredients possible to your patron's table, no matter how far away those ingredients had to come from or how difficult the journey was. The greatest Roman chefs weren't just technical masters. They were also logisticians, diplomats, and strategists. They understood that their ability to cook amazing food was only half the battle. The other half was getting the ingredients in the first place. And that took courage, intelligence, and an almost obsessive attention to the supply chains that brought the world to Rome. Now, knowing that these ingredients were coming from thousands of miles away, sourced through dangerous trade routes, costing enormous sums of money, it's worth asking how Roman chefs actually used them, because if you're paying premium prices for pepper, cinnamon, and exotic spices, you're not just sprinkling them on food casually. You're using them deliberately, strategically, understanding that every pinch of that ingredient costs money and represents effort from countless people across the known world. Roman haute cuisine The food prepared for emperors and wealthy elites reflected this obsession with exotic ingredients. Recipes from surviving Roman cookbooks, particularly Apicius, which is basically a collection of recipes for the wealthy, show an almost obsessive use of spices. Every sauce seems to have pepper in it. Many dishes feature cinnamon, often in unexpected ways. Garum shows up constantly. These ingredients weren't used sparingly. They were used abundantly, especially in wealthy households. A dish prepared for the emperor might have multiple exotic spices, multiple layers of seasoning that reflected the best of what the known world had to offer. It was about displaying wealth and power through flavor. A meal that featured 4 different exotic spices was a meal that said, "Look how much I can afford. Look at the connections I have. Look at the resources available to me." Roman chefs understood this perfectly. They weren't just cooking food. They were creating statements of power and prestige. One particularly famous Roman dish that relied heavily on imported ingredients was a sweet wine sauce called mulsum. It combined wine, honey, and often spices like pepper or cinnamon. This sauce was served with meats, with bread, with various dishes. To make it, you needed wine, which could come from various parts of the empire. You needed honey, which came from across the Mediterranean. And if you wanted to make a fancy version, you'd add imported spices. A single sauce might therefore represent trade goods from 3 or 4 different regions. Every spoonful was kind of a summary of Rome's global reach. Another famous preparation was the use of what modern people might call a chimichurri, or herb sauce. But the Roman version featured garum as a base with added herbs and sometimes imported spices. This sauce appeared at almost every wealthy Roman meal. It was like the ketchup of ancient Rome, except it was way more expensive and way more complicated to make. Getting all the ingredients, maintaining the quality, making sure you had steady supplies. This was a major undertaking. Roman chefs also used exotic ingredients in unexpected ways. Pepper wasn't just for savory dishes. Peppery sauces appeared with some desserts. Cinnamon and other warm spices were used in meat preparations. Frankincense and myrrh were sometimes burned during meals to create an aromatic experience, but they were also used in some preparations as actual ingredients. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. Everything contributed to the overall sensory experience. Chefs would plan menus that showcased their access to the finest ingredients. A 7-course meal for a wealthy patron might feature different spices in each course, demonstrating the breadth of what was available through trade networks. It was a way of saying, "I have access to everything. I can bring you the flavors of Egypt, India, Arabia, all in one evening." Some of the most prestigious, as Roman chefs became almost celebrities in wealthy circles. They were known for their ability to source rare ingredients, for their creativity in using them, for their understanding of what flavors worked together. A chef who could consistently surprise the wealthy with new flavor combinations, who had access to ingredients others didn't, who understood the subtleties of spices that most people never encountered, that chef was in incredible demand. Wealthy Romans would compete to hire the best chefs, would pay enormous salaries, would give them resources and authority to ensure they got access to the best ingredients. It was a prestige thing, obviously, but it was also a genuine culinary achievement. Creating innovative food with unfamiliar ingredients, combining spices in ways that hadn't been tried before, understanding how to balance flavors from different parts of the world. This required real skill. A Roman chef working in the 1st century AD was doing something that most of the world wouldn't experience again until much later, when global trade networks had been re-established. They were working with a global pantry, combining ingredients from everywhere, creating fusion cuisine before fusion cuisine was even a concept. They were pioneers, really, in understanding how different flavor profiles from different cultures could work together. The challenge was real. You're working with ingredients you might never have encountered before. You don't have reliable reference materials about how to prepare them. You don't have other chefs to consult about how to use them. You have to experiment, try things, fail sometimes, learn from your mistakes. And you have to do all of this while being judged by the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. People who are paying enormous sums for their meals and expecting them to be exceptional. But the best Roman chefs rose to the challenge. They created menus that showcased not just their technical skill, but their understanding of spices, their appreciation for the flavors of different lands, their ability to combine ingredients in new and interesting ways. They understood that real prestige in Roman cooking came from understanding these global trade networks and using them creatively. Now, all of this exotic ingredient sourcing and global trade, it's so romantic. Sounds exciting. But the reality for Roman chefs and merchants was often grim. Sourcing these ingredients was dangerous, expensive, and unreliable. Supply chains broke down, ships sank, pirates attacked, political instability disrupted trade routes. A chef planning an important meal for a wealthy patron couldn't always rely on getting the ingredients they wanted when they wanted them. This created constant stress, constant negotiation, constant adaptation. A chef might source pepper expecting it to arrive by a certain date, only to have the shipment delayed by months due to weather. Then they'd have to adjust their menus, use what they had available, sometimes substitute ingredients at the last minute. It happened constantly. The spice trade, for all its glamour and prestige, was fundamentally unstable. Prices fluctuated wildly, depending on supply and demand. A good harvest in India meant pepper prices in Rome might drop. A single ship lost to pirates or weather could cause severe shortages. Political conflicts could suddenly close off trade routes that had been reliable for years. A chef had to stay aware of these market fluctuations, had to understand what was happening in distant lands, had to be ready to adapt when circumstances changed. Some of the most successful Roman chefs were the ones who maintained multiple suppliers, who didn't rely on single sources for important ingredients, who understood the risks inherent in global supply chains and planned accordingly. They were like modern supply chain managers, really, just working with ancient technology and ancient politics. The acquisition of exotic ingredients also required financial resources. A wealthy Roman household might have a considerable budget for food, but there were always constraints. A chef had to make choices about which ingredients to prioritize, what to spend money on, how to balance expense with quality. A chef working for an emperor might have unlimited resources, but a chef working for a wealthy merchant or aristocrat had to be more careful. They'd have to negotiate with suppliers, try to get better prices, sometimes substitute cheaper alternatives when premium options were too expensive. It was a constant balancing act, and the stakes were high. If you couldn't deliver the expected quality of ingredients and food, you might be replaced. A chef who consistently ran out of key ingredients or delivered disappointing meals would find themselves without employment quickly. Wealthy Romans expected results. They expected to taste the spices they were paying for. They expected exotic, interesting food that demonstrated their status and wealth. A chef who couldn't deliver that was a liability. So there was constant pressure to source better ingredients, to maintain supply chains, to find new suppliers, to discover new ingredients that nobody else had access to yet. A chef who could bring a completely unknown ingredient to a wealthy patron's table, something nobody else in Rome had access to yet. That chef had accomplished something remarkable. It demonstrated not just skill, but also connections, knowledge, resourcefulness, the ability to operate in a complex global system. Some of the most successful Roman chefs built careers on this kind of innovation, constantly seeking out new suppliers, new ingredients, new flavor combinations that would impress their patrons. They traveled. They corresponded with merchants across the empire. They maintained networks of contacts who could inform them about new products, new trade routes, new opportunities. They were entrepreneurs in many ways, constantly working to expand the range of what was available to their kitchens. The challenge of sourcing exotic ingredients also meant that Roman chefs had to develop deep knowledge about those ingredients. They had to understand pepper, not just as a spice, but as a product. What regions of India produced the best pepper? How did growing conditions affect flavor? How should pepper be stored to maintain quality? How should it be used in different preparations to get the best flavor? This knowledge came from experience, from talking to suppliers, from experimenting with different sources. A chef who could taste the difference between pepper from different regions of the Malabar coast had real expertise. A chef who understood why certain cinnamon was superior to other cinnamon, who could taste the subtle differences in frankincense from different sources, that was someone with profound knowledge. This kind of expertise was valuable. It was the difference between a good chef and a great chef. It was the kind of thing that kept wealthy patrons happy and coming back for more. The logistics of ingredient sourcing also affected how Roman chefs worked seasonally. Certain ingredients were only available at certain times of year. Fresh ingredients from across the empire had their seasons. Dried and preserved ingredients had their own considerations about freshness and quality. A chef had to plan around these seasonal variations, had to know when to expect new supplies to arrive, had to understand how to store and preserve ingredients during off-seasons. Spring might bring fresh vegetables from North Africa. Summer brought abundant Mediterranean produce. Fall and winter meant relying more on preserved goods, dried ingredients, stored goods. A good chef worked with these seasonal patterns, creating menus that reflected what was available and fresh at any given time. This actually created a kind of rhythm to Roman cuisine that modern people might appreciate. It was seasonal, localized in many ways despite the global sourcing, responsive to what was actually available at any given moment. Roman chefs couldn't just decide they wanted fresh figs in January if figs weren't in season. They had to wait. They had to plan. They had to be patient. Or they had to find ways to preserve figs, to dry them, to prepare them in ways that would keep them available year-round. This required knowledge, planning, and resourcefulness. The greatest Roman chefs understood these constraints and worked within them creatively. They created menus that showcased the best of what was available at any moment, that took advantage of seasonal abundance, that used preserved and stored goods effectively during scarce periods. They understood that real mastery wasn't about having unlimited access to everything. It was about understanding what you had, what was available, how to use it best, how to create amazing food with whatever resources you had access to at any given moment. This is actually something that modern chefs are rediscovering, this attention to seasonality, this understanding that constraints can actually lead to better creativity. Roman chefs figured this out 2,000 years ago, working with global trade networks that were unreliable, unpredictable, and challenging. They made it work. They created cuisine that was celebrated, that commanded respect, that demonstrated both their skill and their understanding of a complex global system. Their legacy reminds us that great cooking isn't just about tea technique. It's about understanding ingredients, where they come from, how to source them, how to use them creatively. It's about working with constraints, about being resourceful, about constantly learning and adapting. And it's about understanding that every ingredient on a plate represents effort, money, travel, negotiation, and countless people across the world working together to bring flavors to a table. When you sit down to eat, when you taste something that's been prepared with care and excellence, you're tasting the result of all that effort. Roman chefs understood this. They respected their ingredients. They understood the global systems that brought them to their kitchens. And they used that knowledge to create food that was not just delicious, but meaningful. So the next time you taste an exotic spice, when you eat something that's come from far away, remember the Roman chefs working in their kitchens 2,000 years ago, dealing with the same challenges you might face. They were working with perishable goods, unreliable supply chains, limited information, and enormous pressure to deliver excellence. And somehow they managed it. Somehow they created a culinary tradition that still influences how we cook today. Somehow they built a system that brought the flavors of the world to their tables, despite every obstacle and challenge. That's extraordinary. That's worth remembering. That's worth celebrating. In the grand arc of culinary history, the Roman chef's mastery of global sourcing stands as a testament to human ingenuity and determination. These weren't people with modern tools, modern information, modern conveniences, yet they accomplished something remarkable. They wove together a system of trade that spanned continents. They created a cuisine that was sophisticated, ambitious, and genuinely innovative. They understood that the best cooking happens when you respect your ingredients, when you understand where they come from, when you work with what's available rather than against it. And they understood that a single meal could tell a story about power, about wealth, about the vastness of the world and your place in it. That's a legacy worth honoring.